Pleasure meeting.
Thanks for coming out.
You bet.
All right.
Right.
My name is Dan Feltus. It's an honor to serve as state senator for Concord. And one of the benefits of serving as your state senator is I also have the honor of helping welcome to New Hampshire and welcome to Concord wonderful candidates for President of the United States, because you know what? Let me just ask a question. Who here is excited to kick Donald Trump out of the White House? I am too. And we have a great candidate here today with us at Concord Craft, helping to, I think, show everybody what it's like to get things done in a red state, what it's like to win in a red state, what it's like to advance progressive issues like getting dark money out of politics.
All right.
Advance progressive issues like just expanding Medicaid expansion to 100,000 Montanans, including 10,000 who need it for much needed substance use disorder treatment. He is getting things done. We would be very fortunate if he were our nominee, and it's an honor to welcome to Concord and to New Hampshire Governor Steve Bullock.
Thanks, Senator, but thank all of you for coming out. And I think as Dan says, you gather for the sake of our nation, for the sake of our nation's standing in the world, for the sake of what we're going to pass on to our kids and grandkids. Folks are gathering all over this country to make sure that Donald Trump is a one-term president, for sure. But I don't think that's the only reason why. It's not just beating him, it's rejecting the behavior that he's now normalized. The lies and the misstatements, the dividing us by race, by gender, and by geography. Twitter tirades, temper tantrums. We now expect more out of our preschoolers than we do the President of the United States. And I think it's also more than just beating him and rejecting that behavior. You know, as I travel around, a whole lot of folks turn around and say this economy isn't working for them. You can turn around. When I was growing up in the 1970s, 90% of 30-year-olds were doing better than their parents were at age 30. Today it's half. People are working harder, they're making less. Average wages haven't increased for the real workers in 40 years. Or if you're from a rural area of the state, like I am, in Montana, 2/3 of the county's actually lost businesses in the last decade. And you shouldn't have to leave your home or your church or your community just to make a decent living. And then folks turn around when the economy's not working for them and they look at the political system. Before Citizens United, 2% of all the spending, outside spending, was from groups that don't disclose the donors. Today it's over half. Or you look at literally tax cuts being written because this is what the donors asked for. Or environmental regulations being gutted because this is what the oil companies are asking for. There's no wonder in some ways that folks are frustrated and anxious and angry, but instead of doing something about it, Donald Trump's poured gasoline on that fire. We are more divided today than any time in my lifetime. And forget cable news or Twitter. Can't even have conversations around a Thanksgiving dinner without politics dividing us. And that's not the promise of this country. We're better than that. With my background briefly, raised in a single-parent household, paycheck to paycheck. I only knew there was a governor's house in town because I delivered newspapers to it, so I've made it 4 blocks in life from where I was raised. I worked my way through college, borrowed my way through law school. I'll never forget that day that my wife and I paid off what would be $175,000 in law school loans. But you know what? I had a chance from delivering newspapers to the governor's house as a kid to now raising our 3 kids in. And we got to be clear-eyed that for a whole lot of folks, that fair shot no longer exists. For a whole lot of people in this country, they never had that same shot. That's why it's about beating Donald Trump, but it's also about making sure our economy and our political system is working for folks. Now, I think that we got to be clear-eyed. If we don't change our strategy, if we can't win back some of the places that we lost, and if we can't give people a reason to vote for us, not just against him, Donald Trump could well win next year. I think it can be done. I've seen it done. 2016, I was the only Democrat in the country to get reelected in a statewide race where Donald Trump took the state. He won Montana by 20 points. I won by 4. 25 to 30% of my voters voted for Donald Trump. And there's a lesson there along the way, because I don't have the luxury of just trying to find those pockets of blue. I have to actually travel all across the state. I have to give people a reason to vote for us, not just against me. And whether it's here in New Hampshire, or it's New York, or it's in Michigan or Wisconsin, we can't write off places in this country just because we didn't do well in the past. If we do, we could well lose. I get that I'm like the 37th candidate in the race, and some folks said, well, what took you so long? And Senator Feltes mentioned in part, I had a job to do, governor, and I had to save Medicaid expansion for 100,000 Montanans. I had to get meaningful stuff done. Even this time of great division, I think it can be done because I've seen it done before. My legislature is 60% Republican. And even with that legislature, yes, we passed Medicaid expansion. Yes, we actually got dark money, undisclosed money out of our elections, record investments in our education system, fourth lowest tuition and fees for college tuition in the nation, freezing college tuition 6 out of 8 years, and also not just making it about some folks that are going to college, making our 2-year colleges about professionally recognized certificates and degrees and apprenticeships. So now actually more people are climbing the ladder in the middle class in Montana than any state in the country. And I've been able to do that, but that doesn't mean you compromise your values. I look for common ground, but I also have more vetoes than any governor in the history of our state. Never once compromised on a woman's right to make her own health care decisions. Consistently preserved access to both the ballot box and the courthouse for injured workers. I've kept our public lands in public hands. And every attempt to take away the rights to organize and collectively bargain in the state of Montana, I veto.
Yeah.
And I think that, well, thank you, because it is important. And when I think that we're getting to a point, how I win and how I govern is much the same. Never forget when we were trying to get Medicaid expansion through the first time. This was 2015, the heart of sort of anti-Obamacare. I went to this town called Choteau, Montana. Choteau is 1,700 people. It's on the Rocky Mountain front. It's going up there for a community meeting. It was during our legislative session. Everyone in town knew why I was coming because the Koch brothers were nice enough to mail pictures of me and Barack Obama together saying, Bullock's coming to your community to destroy your healthcare system. But I showed up, and instead of just telling them what I thought they needed, I listened. First speaker gets up, and he was the hospital administrator. Said 43% of the people that walk through these hospital doors don't have health insurance. A couple speakers got up, called me a communist or something like that. But then I think the fifth speaker, he wasn't even from Choteau. He was the chair of the county commission. He was from a town called Bynum, population 50. We call that a suburb in Montana. But he was a rancher, and he was the chair of the county commission. And he got up and said, you know what, I was born in this hospital. This hospital saved my life 2 years ago. If we lose this hospital, this town's gone. So instead of me telling them everything that they need, them telling me what they need gave them the courage, that Republican legislator, the courage to defy the Koch brothers, defy party leadership, vote to expand health care in our state, when every single vote mattered. As a result, we've gone from 20% uninsured back then to 6%, 7.5% today. Haven't lost one rural hospital. We've actually been able to make things work, and that's how government should work. I do think that DC could teach or learn a lot from Montana. I'm not going to say it'll be that easy. You know, I hear, well, Montana, it's just a small state, bigger population than states like Vermont or Delaware, I'm just saying. But I think until we address the one thing that's holding us back in so many ways, and that's the corrupting influence of dollars in our system. Everything else that Democrats are talking about right now will be that much harder. Think about it. DC is captured by the money. Lindsey Graham literally said, we got to get these tax cuts through to make our donors happy. At the same time that 44% of Americans wouldn't have $400 in their pocket in case of an a family medical emergency or the car broke down. Drug companies invest big in our elections. We pay more for prescription drugs and healthcare than any country in the world. We've got nothing to show for it. A whole generation of workers have been replaced by independent contractors. At the same time that union membership's half of what it was in 1980. And big oil is making record profits, and Republicans aren't even acknowledging that the climate crisis is real. So I think we have to take steps to actually address what's happened in this system. $1 billion of dark money since Citizens United. If we're ever going to get anything else moving again in Washington, D.C. for us, it can be done. I've seen it done before. I was Attorney General when this case called Citizens United came up. If you don't know the case, it equated money with speech and corporations with people. And the court brought that decision down. Remember, Democrats actually controlled both houses of Congress and the presidency. We talked about it. They decried it, they gave speeches about it, but they didn't do anything. Every other state in the country said, nothing we can do. And I know that you have corporate spending here. Nothing that we could do. Montana had this great history of, the 1900s, these wealthy copper barons, we call them the Copper Kings, literally controlled every local, state, and federal election. The point that Mark Twain talked about it, and he said, William Clark, by his example, he buys politicians like other people buy food. By his example, he's made corruption smell sweet. And regular Montana says enough is enough. It passed this, it's called the Corrupt Practices Act of 1912. Banned all corporate spending in our elections or contributions. Elections became about this, about people talking to people, not how much money you raised or what the corporation said. So I knew I owed it. I brought the first case up after Citizens United. We actually got testimony from Republicans talking about what even the threat of this spending could do. Took it to the U.S. Supreme Court, the first case up, 5-4 decision. They got rid of 100 years of Montana history. Taught me two things. One of which, don't ever doubt what one Supreme Court justice can do when it comes to women's rights, rights for our workers, representative democracy. If this is going to work, it matters. And it taught me something else too. I couldn't give up. So I went back to that time my legislature was about 2/3 Republican. We passed this law that said 90 days out from an election, if you're going to spend in our elections, you got to disclose every single nickel that you're spending. I don't care if you call yourself Americans for America, or whatever it is. I'll never forget, I'm running for re-election in 2016. And 91 days out, Americans for Prosperity, the Koch brothers, had mailings all across our state that when my children looked at it, they said, boy, Dad, you really are a horrible person. But then on day 90, it stopped. And if we can kick the Koch brothers out of Montana, you ought to be able to kick them out in New Hampshire and every place in this country. Look, this is by far the most important election in my lifetime. And it's about how do we beat Donald Trump, but even more than that, how do we preserve this 243-year experiment called representative democracy? And if we're really going to do it, we have to win back some of the places that we lost last time, in addition to bringing out our base. We do have to give people a reason to vote for us, to believe that they will have a fair shot at a better life. We've got to actually fight to get the money out of the elections, but people got to believe we'll be fighting for them each and every day. I'm an optimist. I have 3 young kids. You kind of have to be optimistic. But more than that, I think that that's the core of what we are and who we are as Americans. We know we're actually at our best when all the voices can be heard, not when we're divided into warring camps, or when civility can replace anger, and we can talk about what we share, or that no matter who you are or who your parents are, you have that chance at a better life. I do believe we can be that country again. That's why I'm in this. I'm excited to be here. This won't be the last time you see me in New Hampshire.
Woo!
And I'd be, I'll stop now.
Come back to Merrimack County.
I will. And I'll stop now, and I'd be willing to answer almost any question. Yes, sir.
Governor, thank you for being a strong opponent of money in politics and making Congress work for the people again. When I hear you talk about public funding of elections, which if you're our next president, I think you ought to push for really hard to the point where about this time in 2021, you could sign it into law,
Yeah.
Sarbanes-Bill or something similar.
Yeah. Well, and first thing I do, and Montana's the only state that did this too. I mean, without even getting Congress to move, I signed an executive order that said, if you want to contract with the state of Montana, you know, under the current Citizens United, I can't tell you you can't spend in my elections. But if you're even going to bid for a contract, I want you to disclose every single way that you are spending or contributing to influence my elections. Think about if the federal government did that. Literally, we contract with every business in the country. That sunshine would add something. Another thing, when Trump was with Putin in Helsinki, that same day, his Secretary of Treasury said, we're going to get rid of this little rule that actually requires for these 501c4s, these nonprofits, to actually collect their donors, major donors, and give their names to the IRS. So literally right now, the Russians could give to the NRA, spend in our elections, and no one would know. This rule had been around since Richard Nixon. He's not the model of transparency. So we're in federal court against him right now. To your point, I think when it comes to public financing of elections, I think that we should look at ways to do it. But what we've seen, and the problem becomes, until we can address Citizens United head on, is that we can limit what a candidate is spending, but when dark money groups and undisclosed groups, when $1 billion has been spent in our federal elections since Citizens United, of folks where we don't even know who wrote that check. Until we can address that part of it, it's going to be real hard to make sure that people believe that the system works for them. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Becca. I'm a 21-year-old American Jew. So as a Hebrew school teacher, I get to teach children what it means to be Jewish, and I also have to teach them about the oppression and state violence that our people have experienced. So I really need a leader who's going to stand against injustice everywhere. I saw that you recently told the New York Times that there have been some challenges with Netanyahu's decisions, but you refused to name any specific challenges. So I'm wondering if you would consider Israel's denial of human rights to millions of Palestinians to be a challenge that you would address as president, and I'd love to know whether, as president, you will push the Israeli government to end the occupation.
Sure, and thank you for the question, too. I mean, we have to get to a two-state solution, and we have to recognize one of our most trusted allies that we have to support is Israel, but it can't be done alone. And the occupations, the territories are making it that much more challenging along the way.
So you would push for an end to the occupation?
Yes.
Great.
And it's not, you know, it was interesting, and I'll say two things. And I think that we do actually have to get back to, like, I don't know if that was in the interview, I wouldn't have moved the embassy without getting something if we're not bringing everybody together and saying the long term is to figure out a two-state solution. We're going to be in a lot of trouble. I was in the Chicago airport, and this was right after, you know, usually even as the governor of Montana are getting into this, you don't get stopped by people, but a rabbi from outside of Chicago came up and said, hey, Bullock, I saw you on Rachel Maddow. So I started asking him, like, what is the solution for peace in Israel? And his response to me was, I am more concerned about the fact that I have to have men and women with guns outside my synagogue here, too. So I think that we not only have to recognize what can be done, but also the division that we're starting to have in this country. Yes, sir.
Hello, Governor. My name is Alden, and I'm an ACLU voter.
Hey, Alden.
Which means I prioritize civil liberties when I can. So everyone has the right to vote everyone has a stake in their own future and their family's future when they vote, and they should have the right to, even if they've made serious mistakes in the past, i.e. felonies or jail. Would you support the ability of people in prison to still vote while serving time?
I would not, Alden. I mean, we fully restore rights once you're out of prison, but would not while in prison. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hi, Governor. The U.S. currently sits at $22 trillion in debt, and that number is expected to expand significantly in the next 10 years. Since 2000, the debt has increased significantly under both Republican and Democratic administrations. As president, what steps would you take to reduce the debt?
Yeah. So the question was, debt is increasing significantly under Republican and Democratic administrations, though to be fair, it's actually been reduced more under the Democrats than the Republicans. What steps would you take to reduce the federal deficit? And it's an interesting time because Republicans used to care about the federal deficit. And now this tax cut will put $1.5 trillion onto our kids and grandkids over the next 10 years. At the same time that whoever cleans this place up tonight will pay more in taxes than companies like Amazon did, or 60 of the Fortune 500. As governor, I've had to balance a budget each and every year. I don't think a president could come in and say, we're immediately going to balance a budget, but it's something that I'm very, very conscious of, and then that's when we talk about new programs. If I don't have ways to pay for them, I'm not going to be proposing. So I think that we do have to be conscious of what the debt is that we're putting on, but I think it's going to be a long-term issue to actually get out of it. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
First of all, I thank you so much for all you've been doing about Dark Money. It's amazing, and everybody here who hasn't seen the Dark Money movie by PBS needs to see it.
Yeah, there's a movie called Dark Money that has me in it too.
I have a different
That's what she's
topic
talking
that I'd
about.
really like
Please.
to ask you about. I'm very concerned because I know that 53% of our discretionary federal budget is spent on the military alone, whereas infrastructure, education, science, all of that, it's like 6 to 8% of the budget, teeny little slices. I'd like to know if you see that as a problem, and I'd like to know what you might do to remedy it.
So I do see it as a problem, and we have always had these forever wars. When we were actually in times of conflict in the past, we would raise revenues in part to address the others. I think that we need to continue our leadership in the world, because it's not just in America's interest, right? We have this post-World War II order where our allies expect us, even if this administration is moving back from that. So I think you do have to take a critical chance of getting prosecuted. What we have done in Montana, even with that legislature, is a package of about 8 bills on criminal justice reform, both trying to keep people out of prison, changing our sentencing along the way, and then on the back end, turning around and saying, how can we better reintegrate into a community and not have to stay in forever? So when it comes to like a specific 50% number, it's hard for me to say right now, but I think we do have to take significant action. Last question. Yes, ma'am.
Me?
Yes, ma'am.
I would like to know what you would do about immigration.
Yeah.
Not only that we're doing bad things now, but what policy would you propose?
Yeah, well, and thanks for the question. Now, from a general perspective, I think that Democrats believe in border security. We believe in keeping our communities safe, but we don't believe, or at least I don't believe, in an 18th century solution called a wall for what's a 21st century challenge. And what we have is a humanitarian crisis, but this administration is trying to use immigration to completely divide folks. Folks that have known no other country but ours as their home, the dreamers, they need an immediate path to citizenship. You have another 8 million Americans living in the shadows, undocumented immigrants in this country. And let's be honest, 2/3 of them have lived here longer than a decade. They too, we have to find a path at the end of the line, pay a fine, but we need to welcome them as their citizens. We, as our country, we have always been stronger. We are a country of immigrants. cynically what he is using is this to divide us. And if you look at the specific border crisis, at the same time that he's saying all these folks are coming, well, we're cutting off aid to the Central American countries, and we're exacerbating.
What do you think our future policy should be aside from separating families and building walls, which a lot of us.
Yeah, path to citizenship.
What?
A path to citizenship for those that are undocumented. You also have a bureaucratic mess in as much as you have 400 judges for 800,000 asylum cases. But no, we shouldn't be separating families. We shouldn't be using it also to rip people in this country apart. I'll close with one thing. So when I got elected governor, it had been 40 years in Montana since kids, the age of my kids, were part of this whole thing. At the time my kids were 6, 8, and 10, and I'll never forget, we move in the governor's residence, and my son kicks a soccer ball, bounced off this painting, and someone says, you know, well, that painting's worth like 200,000 or whatever. Like, get rid of all the damn paintings in the house, right? Because we have to live here. But during my first day of the state, I talked about the difference of having kids the age of ours, both in the residence and in my office. And I said, you know what? Kids learn from our words and our deeds. From how we as leaders treat one another, but also the actions that we take. And I implored that legislature then, it's time to start acting like our kids are watching. I believe that to be more true today than ever before. We have to ask ourselves, what sort of role are we playing, and will that next generation be inspired by or aspire to? At some point, this president is going to have to answer that question. At some point, every one of us running for office as president is going to have to answer that question. And you as the voters are going to have to answer it as well. I do believe that we can become that country again. It's going to take work, and it's going to take rebuilding after it. I so appreciate your all's interest. I know that you take this role seriously, as you should. I look forward to not only being here talking to you, but many trips over the next 230 some days before you ever exercise. So thanks so much for having me.